Good evening. Welcome to People Purpose Place for our regular Monday evening catch up. Great to see Christine and Darren here. How are you this evening?
Rowan, you sound really glitchy to me. Does he sound glitchy to you, Darren?
No, he sounded pretty good to me, actually.
Oh, okay. Okay, then it's just me. Don't worry about me.
Yeah, good. I'm good, Ron. How are you?
Awesome. Yeah. We have cursed ourselves pre this call about our connection, so let's not mention it again.
Yeah,
If,
exactly. No, now I hear you
out,
perfectly.
if someone
Just yell,
drops out,
it helps the internet connection.
that's it. It's all on them. Stop playing around with the wires.
Yeah, that's it.
So thank you for the time this evening to have a catch up. We have a conversation tonight which we've actually spent a fair bit of time on as practitioners, but healthy homes. What should we be considering and why? Perhaps some of that has come to light over the last little while around pandemics, and we've been thinking about airborne and viral and what is healthy. So maybe we've increased our health awareness. Maybe not. I recently went on an aeroplane. That's right. Went on an aeroplane with lots of people not too worried about their masks and whatever. So just interesting. We had a degree of fatigue perhaps with the whole healthy conversation. Before we jump all the way into that though, I think we have a good practice of starting with a check-in question. And this evening we have a question set aside. What is it that we need to put aside to be present for this evening? Christine, did you want to jump in?
Gee, let me just feel into what I need to put aside. Let me just give me a second. I think I need to put since we're talking about healthy houses, healthy homes and healthy houses, I think I need to put aside my current obsessions with my health. Yeah, that's good enough for me. Thank you.
Awesome. And Darren, anything particularly resonating for you to put aside?
Well, I mean, I think I've got probably Christine to blame for this one. Christine told me to go on. I've got someone to blame. Christine told me to go and dig up the book Master and His Emissary by Ian McGilchrist, which is about brain hemisphere stuff. And it showed up as being, I got it as an audio book, showed up as 27 hours, and I thought, oh my God, I'm not going to get through this. But after about 15 minutes, I was enthralled. So I've been resonating on left and right brains for the last couple of hours while doing my workout. So I'm happy to put that aside. But it's a great book. So thank you for the recommendation, Christine.
It's a great book, but he's very long, and I find that he has this beautiful sonorous voice.
Yes.
And he puts me to sleep. So it takes me forever to listen to one of his books. But it's a great soporific, as well as hugely interesting, because he has a completely different view of how the right brain and left brain are different than the old right brain, left brain. Anyway, that's enough of that. But thanks.
And it actually
took up that recommendation.
Yeah, and it actually does in some ways lead on to the whole conversation around healthy housing, because he's specifically talking about well-being, and he's talking about how our environment is potentially changing the way our brain is working. So I think it's probably a fairly fair segue. What about you, Rowan? What can you leave behind?
We have in my household we have an arrangement coming up for a wedding, which is people are getting very excited about. So I perhaps need to put aside that chaos and catastrophe in the background and sit with this for the moment. So that's probably a good place to start with. And you're right, Darren, as a segue, perhaps societal level stuff is changing in our community, and how our old paradigms of how we saw brains and how we, what is healthy, perhaps worth considering. So at the very starting point about housing and healthy housing, everyone has a exposure to the media and the headline talking about housing, and perhaps everyone's talking about mental health as a very obvious starting point. That successful housing and good housing has a very positive impact on our health. And the converse is true. When you're a parent with a couple of kids living in a tent because you can't find a house, it has a very negative impact on your mental health. So that might be an obvious place to start with. Thoughts around the room, you know, have you seen examples where health has been impacted in a positive or negative way about housing?
I'll let you two lead off with this because, boy, do I have a lot to say on that subject, and I don't want to just run at the mouth and take up the whole hour because I have a lot to say on this subject.
Yeah,
I got probably 3 topics that I wouldn't mind bringing up on that point. I think one of the things where we've been really working towards, and I think what we're proposing with People Purpose Place is probably a bit of a paradigm shift for a lot of people in regards to how they live. But I think the first part in regards to mental well-being, which I think is important to discuss, is that our modern housing is very isolating as well. So I think we're all living in our little silo, and that forever we've been tribal groups. And I think maybe the COVID thing has escalated our isolation. But just that being away from other people is actually a massive impact. And I think, you know, looking at housing in the future, how it could bring us together better would be something important. The other interesting thing that I found, and this is actually just specifically from the book that I'm reading or listening to right at the moment, is this idea that, you know, we've obviously got right and left hemispheres in our brain, but at the moment, our modern brain is obviously configured or is being worked over more in the left side of our brain, you know, doing lots of details. And that's potentially very confusing for our brain because the apparently looks at the big picture. So we're spending so much time looking at details that we're not looking at the big picture, which ultimately means we're in a confusing time. I think we all feel a sense of bewilderment or unease literally at the moment. And I think that can only be amplified by having a poor housing solution. And I think that's actually part of the potential solution. And my last point is that, you know, everyone, you know, has heard of old Maslow. And, you know, he used to talk about the whole idea that the pyramid needs to start by feeling secure. And there's no doubt that in Australia and probably around the world, that what everyone's talking about being the housing crisis, for most people is a homing crisis, and it's real. And I think until you actually are in that place, you don't know how real it is and how all-consuming it can be for those people. So, and we've seen it, we hear the stories that are powerful on them, and I hope, you know, maybe in a couple of weeks or months we can get some of those people in who are in those situations to share their stories, because we look at this from an academic level, but a lot of people are living that, and it's deeply troubling for them. So those are probably my 3 points specifically around well-being.
Very big topics, and indeed we could cover several hours, but let's soldier on with bringing us together better. How do you see housing could facilitate that? At the moment, in a societal sense, we drive in these tin boxes around the countryside to and from places of work. We get back to our residence and press a remote button, the door goes up, we drive inside, and then we connect to the next screen. So that sounds perfect, doesn't it?
Oh, perfect. Just a simple line of continuity from Paleolithic times to the 21st century. Perfect line of steady continuity.
Yeah.
Not.
Yeah.
And the question is, what's a human being meant to be? And I mean, from the start of sociobiology back in the 70s and 80s, which has now turned into evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology and all that kind of thing. How far have we strayed from the original, where, you know, the maximum number of people was 150 in a group? Well, that's Dunbar's number anyway.
Yeah.
And who knows if that's right or wrong, or how big the groups really were, but that's approximately. And 150 people, you can be related one way or the other to all of them. You can know all of their names, and you can know a lot about them.
Yeah.
You get to have more than that, you're pretty lost. And I think that I would say that I've really filled my own life with lots and lots and lots of people, and but never tribes.
Yes.
Never tribes. So you know, then you're somewhat adrift when you think, how am I going to be part of a little tribe that comes together, 4 or 5 or 6 people, and actually know how to interact? I've never learned it. I've never practiced it.
Yeah. But you're 100% right. I mean, one of the things that, you know, Dunbar does talk about in his numbers, that even if you can reach to 150, and so that would go to say that anyone maybe who has, you know, 500 followers or 5 million followers or what, or even, you know, 500 followers or 500 friends, probably the reality of you know, really having a genuine understanding of those people is probably pretty limited. And he talked about getting down to your intimate group as maybe being 5 or maybe 15, as you said. And I think because we've gone so far away from that evolutionary movement, you know, like families have got smaller. So our immediate group of around us, our immediate tribe is not even going to be that large. So we're almost relearning the process of forming a tribe, which I think is what we're trying to do, you know. So, you know, what's your thoughts, Ryan?
It's interesting. I think that we're trying to capture tiny micro bits of data and compare egos about who's got the most bits of data under control, when the horsepower of the abacus that we're using is only getting greater and greater on a daily basis. So if we struggle to keep up with all these bits of data and all these tiny snippets of people's lives that we don't truly understand who they are. We know they vote, you know, they follow the same football team, or, you know, they've got some inkling, but that's it. We couldn't really call them intimate people that we know or friend. You know, we wouldn't recognise them in the street. Yet we're having this micro competition about tiny snippets of data, and every day the computers are getting better and better and better at it. So in actual fact, on Twitter, Elon pointed out that there's more robots, or there's, you know, so many fake accounts because they're just trolling it for the data. Maybe we should relax about the data and let the robots and the powerful abacus go and do the data bit. And how about we concentrate on doing the human bit? Now that to me would seem like a good fit.
Yep.
I don't know where that's going, but I suspect we will find ourselves very redundant. We talk about automated cars as an example, that it's not far from them being common occurrence, and that will obsolete 10% of the world's workforce. So what do you do with those humans?
That's probably why I think it's actually a larger imperative. Like, we've sort of originally started looking at some of these conversations around homing and housing, but I think as time's gone on, we've realized that it's actually more important with the people journey. That's been hard for us as individuals, working to understand how do we fit into a people journey. But I think we've realized that people joining component of the house is actually going to be probably one of the most important things. I would say undoubtedly the most important component of what we've been playing with, specifically because of this idea around well-being and how important that is, and how critical that is to the future of humans as humans.
I suspect the whole chasing, you know, myriads of bits of information isn't the best use of our humanness, our potential.
Yeah,
we need artists, and we need emotion, and we need collective stories to be told and shared, and all of the work we've done in groups of people. We often refer back to, we'd like to cook our own bit of food, we'd like to sit around a fire, we'd like to tell stories on a Saturday night. It's a really primal core tenet of our humanness, and chasing screens down the road with ones and zeros, changing them from this to that sort of result, seems to be a really poor use of our time.
100%.
Interesting. So there's bringing us together better. I think a home can definitely do that, and some of that maybe we're touching on the common things. So the common food, the common hearth, the common singing a song together. Like even if you sing it badly.
Yeah, I've heard you sing.
It's a pretty binding sort of experience.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. The mental health component of housing is, and interestingly, having spent a little bit of time just recently in a certainly not first world, they're an emerging economy, but they have a much better sense of community and togetherness in Bali than I suspect we have here. And perhaps they're not spoilt rotten with refrigerators and hot and cold running everything. So they still have that community connectedness piece really well.
But the question is, how do we retrieve that? Because I was born in 1949. I'm a complete baby boomer, so I've done the whole technology journey. And I've done the whole, I was born in America, which is the most individualized country and the most dichotomized country at this point in the world. But it's always been very individualistic. And I was brought up to be a striver and an achiever for myself. Now, I know that everything I've done my whole life that was successful has been done in a team. I know that. But man, have I been a bad team member and a bad team leader at times, because I never learned that shit,
Right.
And it's really important to have those lessons. So, the question is, how do we re-educate ourselves to do something that, for example, in my case, I've spent my whole life, I've worked a lot on my inner stuff, but how much have I really learned about becoming very intimate with a few people and still having my privacy? Boy, that whole thing befuddles me to the point that I fear not being able to do it. I'm willing to have a go, but I'm not willing to predict success, because how many times do you have to practice anything you're doing before you get good at it?
I think that's probably one of the most important things, is us as a group trying to model as much of that as we can, and model by failure as much as success. And we talked in last week's meeting about having a joyful experience and having a moment of connectedness at that meeting on Thursday. But we've all just since then had as many meetings. I'm sure we've gone, well, that was a waste of time, or geez, that didn't come off right. That person didn't quite get what I was trying to say, or I didn't do a very good job at articulating myself. So one thing I suppose I'm being conscious of, and maybe Rowan and yourself, Christine, have maybe made me more aware of this, is that I probably need to trial and learn as much of those things to experience them on myself to hopefully be more attuned to help others do it as we continue on this journey. So this idea of modeling and learning ourselves, and you're showing an example by saying, hey, I fully hands up acknowledge that I'm not 100% comfortable in this step, but I'm still taking steps in the right direction. And if someone had said to me, 5 years ago, hey Darren, I want you to do, breath work and spend some time in meditation and embodiness, I would have just laughed at them. But that's what I do every day now.
Or read Ian McGilchrist.
What sort of lunatic
without going to sleep.
Exactly, and I think there's a journey to be had there, and I think we're all going on it, and I think that's the only way we can help others, is to also, we can't just, it's not a technical adventure anymore. We've got to get our hands dirty and trip over, and I don't know what you think, Graham, but I think we're all trying in our own way to experience and express that.
I think the advantage that sorry, Christine.
No, go.
I think the advantage we have is that we have this around such a basic need. We've got this framework in a home. So, and we don't have to be exceptional. As Christine pointed out, you may have some reservations and some trepidation going to this whole sharing and a different way of looking at things. That's completely okay, because we have an architecture around you that will bounce you off the walls and point you back down the general direction. Now, you'll choose your rate, and you'll choose the people around you, and you choose how much of this you might want to take on. But there is a framework in mind to support you on the journey. So, and ultimately, we're picking the low-hanging fruit from a group of people who have something in common, a common purpose. So whether they be friends or whether they be around a purpose of rehabilitating tropical rainforest, that's a binding element. If you were complete and utter strangers, at least you would have something in common that's enduring.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a good point. Also, that idea of people. I think one thing that maybe is missing in today's world is everyone started to throw around these words, sense of meaning or missing meaning or missing purpose. And I think sometimes that alignment might be easier in a smaller group than it is a large group. Like, we can already see this whole polarization with large groups of people, but I think in smaller groups of people, you can find your meaning or your purpose or an alignment. Like we did last Thursday, being able to, Thursday week, being able to find that alignment over certain things that can draw you together. I think there's something incredibly powerful with that. And I think that's why it's worth taking the risk to find out how we get there, more of that. And I think the idea of, to some extent, solving a problem while joining humanity while fixing it is a great way to do it. We know that housing is a problem, or homing is a problem. What if by solving that problem, we're also giving an opportunity for an enrichment in life? Then maybe that's the double whammy. Maybe that's why people are actually the people who, as you said, the people who are trying to do the work are at least willing to take the risk.
Yeah. Christine spoke about teams earlier, and I think absolutely small groups of people that have that common purpose. Christine, at an Olympic level, is a pretty high level of achievement, but you have a small group around you that are really quite dedicated and focused. It's incredibly enriching, just that doing it, not necessarily what the result was of the competition, but doing it together as a team. Would that be fair, Christine?
Well, I think so, and I think that the point about that too is that although we have a lot of, especially as a born American, I didn't come here until I was 20, so I had a lot of fixed habits and thoughts and this and that before coming to the best country in the world.
Yeah.
But we all had the experience, as school children, of, and some of them are missing this now because they've had helicopter parents, of having to play games together as a team at school, of having to work with other kids, and really often because we used to play on the street, not that we had a very busy street, because it was the American suburbs, upper middle class suburbs. Of course, there weren't a lot of cars, and everybody washed out for the kids, and we had heaps of playground and forest and everything else. But we still had to figure out the rules of those kind of play. Football or soccer or netball, badminton, croquet. I don't care. You've got rules. But if kids are going to go and play together, they have to discover the rules and then change the rules, because you have a group that's playing well together, and then all of a sudden a great big tall 2 years older young man from down the street or the new neighbor comes along, and you have to change all the rules so that it's fair for everybody, because children do have a good sense of fairness if you let it play out, if you don't bully them into not being fair. So I think that we do have some templates, even people like myself who were brought up in a highly competitive, very individualistic society. We still do have some touchstones for how do you work together in a team. And even if I've done teaming badly in many of my pursuits in life, at least I was trying to form a team, because it was very clear to me that you can't get big things done without having a team of people. You know, there may be one standing out there on the podium or one in front of the microphone, but who's behind them? And having to try to work that out, even badly, is a bit of a template for where we're going. So we're not completely at a loss when it comes to examples.
And I think one of the things that would be interesting as a polarity of that, and I suppose why what we're doing is maybe super important, and you know, Ian just alluded to it in early in this book. You know, he's saying that kids today, because they aren't spending as much time together in those informal friend groups, are now having to be taught what facial reactions mean to the other person. So, you know, and this was I think this version might even just have been a slightly newer revision of the original book. But he's actually saying in a lot of schools now, they're having to explain to kids what that facial reaction means, because they're being so isolated from those individual groups that they don't even know the nuances of basic, yeah, that's a big kid, so we don't go, you know, like, or we're in here and we have to sort this out, and all of those things. That stuff's now having to be taught because not enough of it is happening, which is why maybe what we're doing is more important than it ever has been, or ever could have been.
I guess one of the other points I wanted to touch on as well is that our mental health needs clearly change over time. So we've had lots of examples that when you're in that crisis situation, you'll almost say or do anything as a survival mechanism. So you're the perfect person to take this rental property, or you're the perfect flatmate, or you're the perfect whatever, when you're presenting yourself to get that secure, stable housing. Yeah. And then surprise, surprise, 6 months later, everyone's a bit more relaxed about there's no immediate urgency. So all of those other behaviours that are maybe a higher level, I want to be more creative, I want to stay up late and play music and do painting or something. And that's, oh, hang on, that's completely different to how you were 6 months ago. Well, understandably.
Yeah. Good.
Our mental health changes over time.
Yep.
I guess certainly our level of socialization and requirement to behave in a socialized manner. I mean, you can hold on to a high level of self-control for a short time.
Yeah.
But, you know, at some point you have to let go and just be you, or it's just too exhausting. Yeah, so, you know, how to get to that point, everybody more or less at the same time and align with others, man, not so easy. Yeah. But I think the other thing is that we can't expect it to be, you know, my whole lifetime we've seen steady growth of everything from pollution and CO2 to technology, you know, ability to warm and cool our houses, incomes, stuff. We've just had an increasing level of stuff, of everything you could imagine for all these decades. And how do you reset your expectations so that you see that it's going to do this? It's not always going to do this.
Yeah, you know, the whole growth mindset is actually, it's an economic fallacy that's becoming apparent. And from a sustainable and just a human, you know, am I going to continue to get taller? No, there will be a time at which I stop. Surprise, surprise.
Yeah.
I think moving on from the mental health, because it's a topic that we could easily spend the rest of the time, but we did talk about healthy homes, and perhaps we also have some other topics that immediately come to mind when we think about healthy homes. Christine, this might be a topic specifically that you've got some personal experience about with a mouldy home. That there's, and I'm doing flood remediation work for clients at the moment, so it's certainly topical with our third La Nina in a row, that we're going to have a wetter, longer wet season and more rain around. Mold is something that's insidious. It seems to be everywhere, and maybe there's that background level that we can tolerate. But once it gets above that level, how do you mitigate it and get it back to a level that you can tolerate? Is that sort of what you're finding, Christine?
Well, I'm not finding the answers, but I sure am finding out a lot of data. We're back to the measuring things because, before we completely move into the health side, I think I'm going to defend data a little bit because I have seen how you really have to have somebody guiding you with your health. If you have a complex health problem, which many of us do, and many of them are civilizational diseases, if you have a chronic complex health syndrome of some kind, somebody has to help you. You can't just work on your subjective feelings of what's going on. It's too complex. And somebody has to know the microbiology, and somebody has to know the hormonal stuff, and somebody has to be able to do the Krebs cycle and the citric acid cycle and the this cycle and the transsulfuration cycle and your methylation cycle, all that stuff. And it's really, really hard unless you've been trained in those things. So you have to find somebody who's knowledgeable enough to guide you through testing, because if you don't have some data, you don't know where to start and stop, and you really need a baseline. So, I've even had to go to the extent of getting my house that I live in. I live in the granny flat, so to speak. I sleep in the granny flat. Tested, and it tested very poorly for mold, but that's the only way to know how bad the mold is to get the testing. And your reaction to the mold is something else that you have to test. So I'm going to defend data a little bit, because I think that we have the opportunity to use data in a way that we couldn't before, because we couldn't even test these things. But we have to figure out how to blend the data into your own subjective feelings. I mean, if my psychotherapist heard me now, she would pull her hair out, because she's always urging me to get more connected to my body. Fair enough. I've had people telling me that my whole life, that I work on it. But sometimes you just need the data. So let's find a way of making the 21st century work for going back to Paleolithic humanity. Because we're not going to move out into a bark hut.
No. And nobody's going to. No, the environment certainly changed, and we know what we've done to the environment has changed. I am interested in, so with your illness in particular, what have we been able to understand about what mold does to make that worse? Like, is there a direct connection in your mind, or the research that gets you from saying, hey, mold is not good for me?
Yeah, absolutely. And I have depended on the data for that, because in fact, what I've done is move out of my granny flat, first into a tent, and now onto the front veranda of that little granny flat, which is commodious enough for me to have a bed out there. So I'm living in the open air. Now, what appeared to be an improvement at the beginning sort of leveled off and didn't go anywhere. So now we have to do more testing. Is it me? Is it the house? Have I not moved far enough away from it? Do I have to build another building? Do I have, do I have to buy a brand new caravan that's been all put together with no VOCs and no mold in it? These things get very difficult, and it's easier to ruin your health than to reconstitute it. So the best thing for us to do is not lose it in the first place. However, how do you do that if you live in Lismore and you've been flooded to the rafters and beyond the rafters sometimes? Of course your house is going to be full of mold. Of course you've suffered a trauma. And between the two of those things, you may become so toxic inside, because your building is toxic and you've got all these toxic traumatic things going on in your whole emotional system. Boy, that gets to be a really tricky situation, and none of us is well enough informed.
Yeah, and I think our experience, and probably Rowan can talk to it better than I can, but the experience with Professor Anne Steinemann has certainly opened my eyes enormously, and her explanation of that is probably one of the simplest and best ways I've ever heard to explain that. In that, your immune system, she sort of explains, like a barrel, and if you're exposed to more and more events, your immune system essentially gets full, and then once it's full of toxins, or you're full of impacts from the environment, whether they be biological or chemical or whatever, even electrical or magnetic or whatever might be the case, then once your barrel's full, then you only need the smallest amount of impact after that to trigger what is a raft of responses. And because of the complexity of the human system, even in my wife's own experience, they become really, really complex things. And even the doctors are like, like, we'll try this and we'll try that. And that's where I agree with you 100%. The more research and data we have from people who are both using mainstream methods and non-mainstream methods to investigate these things becomes super important, because we don't yet know enough about it to predict or understand, So I think you can probably add on to that, Rowan, as well.
Yeah, and I think, can I just make one more point about that, because it seems to me that that's sort of parallel to, there's a parallel to what we're trying to do. So we're trying to find a way of incorporating the best of the ancient and the best of the modern in something that fits into modern society, but more reflects where we're coming from. So our sociobiology, our evolutionary heritage, such that we can live a more natural life, but still not have to live in a bark hut. And I think that the parallel between what we're doing and where health is going these days is really striking. You have to find some alternatives. You have to fit into the system in some way. You have to stretch the boundaries in another way. You have to figure out who's willing to go on the journey, and you have to bring the others along if they're as hesitant as even I am, still wanting to go ahead and invest in this whole thing. So where's the parallel with what we're doing? I think it's very clear, and I don't think we want to abandon that. And our health approaches have to be the same. And of course, our poor doctors, our whole medical system is so, I hear people complaining about doctors. All I can do is complain for the doctors and the nurses and the receptionists and everybody who's working in the health field, because COVID really uncovered what was really stinking in our health system, which seemed to work. It was struggling, but it hadn't broken. And now it feels like it's crumbling around the edges. And nobody had the solution to that. And it's sort of the parallel of individual health. Nobody quite knows the answer. So you have to try something. You can't try something that, we're not going to Mars. Okay, let Elon Musk do that. We're not going to Mars. I'm moving into my backyard, That's not Mars. That's a couple meters away from where I was before. But the question is, how do I take a new attitude, or the old and the best of the new, and put them together in a housing project the way I'm putting it together in my health project?
Yeah, very good point. I think that's a very good analogy. It's a very good way to draw that together. The parallels or the similarities with the process is that it's, and I think we talked about this, that it's definitely what we're proposing is a non-linear approach. So everyone's looking to, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, whereas we're going A, Z, Y, a bit of column C, and 5 bits of this. And how about we see how that goes, and be happy to be immersed in the experiment as well of, well, those bits really worked. And there's some stuff that happened organically, and how did that happen? Like, let's go and dig that up and see whether we can replicate some of those bits. And then, hey, here's some other people who are more experienced than us in those areas. Let's grab their ideas and put that into the pie, and hopefully that ends up, with a more informed way to move forward. So, yeah, it's a very good parallel.
The health experience from our time with Professor Anne has been absolutely a revelation. And we think about, we've touched on mold so far, but as a human example, she has a level of sensitivity now that she can know if I'm in her proximity with my mobile phone turned on. It can be on silent and it can be in my pocket. But so she's not even seen that I've got the device. But she'll say, do you mind checking to see if your phone's turned off? Because she genuinely has that level of sensitivity, which is probably accumulated over her lifetime of experience. So there's an ice cream bust in the yard as well.
Yeah, nice. Can you give me a chocolate?
Yeah. Oh, can you order one for me, Rowan?
It's 2 chocolates. Got it.
But you're right, and I mean, even having this conversation, I'm glad we can get to have these conversations, because I would imagine not only a short period of time ago, but there would have only been the standard medical path for Christine's conversation. The idea that humans could be impacted by electronic devices was just classed as that's got to be tin hat sort of people. Where are you people coming from? Whereas I think now we're coming around to this idea of
Darren Meyer dropped out there.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think there's a lag, and so he keeps talking. We've heard everything he has to say, but his mouth keeps moving after he stops talking. I think there's just a lag.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so
he's making a lot more sense this way, though.
Darren, I'll slap him for you the next time I see you.
Darren, you might have just glitched for a minute there, mate.
Yeah, I think he's frozen.
Cool.
But
let him.
That whole EMF thing. I mean, I look at myself and say, how is it possible that I actually don't? I can't feel my mobile phone. I avoid it. I use those ear things. I put it on speaker. I keep it away from me. It's turned off a lot. But
I've noticed it's turned off a lot, Christine.
Yeah, I don't actually feel EMFs at all. However, I have from the 70s been into bioresonance as a form of healing. Well, all the bioresonance is using frequencies for healing, and EMFs are using frequencies for communication. Yet some of the EMFs are very difficult for some people to tolerate. So there's the question, how sensitive can you become, and how sensitive must you become, and what happens to the people who are hypersensitized, like the likes of the professor you were referring to? I can't wait to see some of the work, so I hope we're able to post some of that very quickly and get an interview with her.
I also just wanted to put a shout out to a new subscriber too. Tender Tendies has just joined on as a subscriber, so we appreciate people joining the conversation because we think it's worthwhile. Thank you very much.
Yeah, definitely. We need questions or opinion. If you've got anything to add in, please do.
We'd love that.
The EMF is one that I recall as a kid just being aware of the higher powered, high voltage towers. We had one, a string running through our property that we would go and drive around, working on a farm scenario, but would never hang around underneath it, and it felt different. So it was incidental passing underneath these towers, and it was interesting to see with a bit of condensation that you would spark, and so some of the observations as a child, you'd go, oh, that's interesting. What's that all about? But there was a sense or feeling. Now I don't know that I'm sensitive, but I think most people would have a reluctance to have their house right next to one of those corridors where we have suburbs divided, where there's a high voltage transmission tower. Do you want to be in the house closest to that? I think most of us would, given a choice, would choose not to.
And I think a lot of that stuff we sort of didn't know, and that might even lead on to some of the products and stuff we might talk about now. But a lot of that stuff we didn't know. We didn't know what Teflon was doing to us. We didn't know what, how much lead was in our fuel. And as much as we sort of maybe discredit what EMFs might be doing to us, and maybe the Tin Hat Brigade, we've always, that's not really real. And I think now we're coming around to the idea that, we talked about this idea of using Pascal's wager occasionally, which is, I think we're all starting to say, look, let's just hold our opinions on that. We don't yet know what all that means, and we've previously made a heap of mistakes missing out on products. And I think that's one of the things with a lot of people when I talk to them, even with some of that stuff we've done just recently, Rowan, talking about the materials and products in your home and the impact on you, is quite surprising how people don't realise the type of products that they are actually putting into their home, do they?
No, and I remember the Teflon frying pan as an example. It's known as a forever chemical. Oh, what's a forever chemical? It's in you forever. Oh, well, it can't be good.
And I heard, sorry to interrupt, but I did hear Jason had shot around some stuff to say with this discussion around PFAS, these chemicals that come from agriculture and a few of those areas, and insecticides. They're now finding in America that every placenta, which means every baby, is being born with PFAS in their system. So this is not even physically being exposed to stuff once you get into the environment. It's pre-environmental. So these things are being exposed to children, before they get into the environment, never alone the idea of now, when the first time we heard about this thing called a VOC, we were like, what does that mean? And probably, Rowan, it's worth saying, what is a VOC?
So it's an abbreviation. I love acronyms, but volatile, as in active, organic compound. So VOC, and some of them are completely, a lemon juice. Some of the natural fragrances and flavors and smells and tastes in our environment are naturally occurring VOCs. However, my understanding is that the benzene chemistry is quite common in fragrances because they mimic some of the natural sweet aromas, but do have some fairly severe side effects. So some of the work that Professor Anna, we've actually got an article about to be published even this week, I think, is the likelihood that our understanding of what's in our household chemicals, so we're talking about a healthy house, what we use in our household environment, even down to the fragrance in the soap, the dishwashing liquid, the laundry powder, before we talk about personal care products, put on something under the arms and makeup for the ladies on the face, or whatever your choices are. We know the impact of just a fraction of the makeup what's on that bottle or container. So it's not definite, and at the moment most of those fragrance companies are hiding behind the commercial in confidence. I can't disclose my secret herbs and spices because someone will have a competitive advantage by knowing my Chanel No. 5 recipe. And I suspect that that's really, sooner or later, has to be called out by the community at large to say, hang on, if you want us to ingest this stuff and if you want to wear it and put it on our intimate of intimates, well, we probably need to know what it's doing to our health.
And it is interesting also on that point that, we have to disclose so much about our food now, but the rest of the products in our house, we're not really disclosing that much as the comment in there just recently that in the actual chat is that, seeing the situation where her mother was using pans and the Teflon came off in them. Now, luckily she was saying that we didn't actually ingest them, but how many other chemicals are we ingesting, Right. So one of the things that we've noticed, particularly with air conditioning systems, is particularly in Australia, most of the air conditioning systems are primarily recirculatory. So you spinning the air around. Now, if you have products like, the fresh car smell is a really bad thing. That's chemicals admitting into you, and the idea that you're, putting the air conditioning on, recirculating your car because it's more efficient. Now, not realizing that all you're doing is just re-ingesting those chemicals all the time, where it's no different in a house, because the challenging thing in a house is even when you built it, you can open the windows and you can let that new house smell out. Surprisingly enough, in my house where we use low VOC paints, when you walked into it for the first time, it didn't have smell at all. Yep. Now, my wife is probably a little tiny bit critical, maybe that at the time when we did it, the quality of the paints maybe weren't quite as robust as what traditional paints were, which is why they're using all these chemicals. So they're more scrub and wear rather than wash and wear. But we certainly didn't notice that smell. But, you go and buy a new piece of furniture and you instantaneously smell that, don't you? And then it's inside your house and just getting around, you're getting exposed to micro levels of those chemicals continuously, particularly if you condition your space and you don't open the windows.
Yeah, absolutely. And another one that I recently was doing some reading on, it might have been a Stanford University, so a premium tier 1 university doing research on the topic. And initially they were talking about burning gas in our stovetops inside the house. So when you think about what you're doing there, you're setting fire to gas inside a contained environment. If it's cold and wet outside, as it might be today, you're recirculating that air inside your living space. And flame is taking the oxygen out of the air that you're breathing. And what are you producing when you set fire to that stuff? So it's probably not something that we give a lot of thought to, and maybe you really shouldn't. But we're learning just from an energy system that was a false hope, this transition energy from coal through to pure electric. And so I would highly suggest that you don't stick a gas cooker in today or tomorrow. And if possible, the manufacturer will always say, use your range hood. And the legislation on range hoods is also now says it should be ducted outside of your house. Now, lots of us have a home kitchen setup where that's not the case. So if that's what the manufacturer says and that's what the new legislation says, there's probably a reason for it. Interesting.
There you go.
Even the process of applying heat to food emits gases. The act of cooking it. So even on an electric cooktop, in a frying pan or however you're heating your food, you're going to emit something. So, and some of that might be perfectly the smell of roasting capsicums and onions, or frying capsicums and onions in a bit of butter is pretty tantalizing. But we aren't testing and we don't know necessarily. So if it's by an open fire, caveman style, probably perfectly well ventilated and perfectly fine.
I think that's a good point. And I think maybe even just as a bit of a note there for even some other comments I'm seeing in the chat there is a couple of things that Professor Ann passed on as remediation methods for making your house healthier. And she actually passed on a lot of books to me that weren't quite as interesting, I must admit, as Master and the Emissary, but a bit more technical. But they did pass on some interesting stuff about off-gassing materials. And we're lucky in Australia, we have two things going for us. And one of those is a lot of heat. So if you are going to be exposed to a lot of an environment that you notice might have a higher aroma, which is probably an indication your nose is telling you that there's more chemicals in the environment than it should be. Two things is if you can ventilate it, obviously, as you said, to get the caveman ventilation happening, but also let it heat up. So in our environment, we are lucky that if we're exposed to a high temperature, that can really help that area off gas as rapidly as it can. So that would even extend to new cars. If you could find a way to leave the windows open when it's new, it's probably going to help some of that off-gassing capabilities, hopefully go, and I suppose the difficult thing is that's going into our environment, isn't it? But it's probably better going into its environment necessarily than your internal environment, because as Christine has attested to, our bodies are less capable of dealing with all of those things in higher doses, as we're now starting to see. So,
yeah.
But I think one thing that we have to keep in mind is, especially when we're forming groups, is that there's a huge amount available right now on how to eat healthily. And
yes.
I hate shopping, but my partner loves shopping, and he loves to go to the market and get fresh stuff. So when he comes back from the supermarket, he mostly comes back with green stuff, and they're still using plastic bags, but what he sees in front of him and behind him in the queue at the shop is a whole stack of processed food and bottles of low calorie soft drink and bottles of high calorie soft drink and bottles of, all this artificial stuff. Now, if we're not, a little sign has popped up on my screen saying fresh is best. I don't know where that came from. They're always watching us. They're always watching us. So, I'm not eating my share of McDonald's because McDonald's happened when I was a pre-teenager to me, and we went there for the social scene, because older kids had cars and everything was in a drive-in and everybody sat in the car park at Macca's. But we didn't eat there. It was horrible. We just went for the fun. And the question is today, how do you find people who are going to live together, who not only can find a way to have agreements with each other and on that deeper emotional level work together with each other? How are you going to find the people who don't insist on serving a sugary dessert at the end of every meal, or don't insist on having afternoon tea with pavlova? Instead having that capsicum and onion, or whatever it is, apples and oranges, pawpaw, pineapple if you're in the tropics. And how are we going to self-select? Because we not only have to self-select out of the deeper layer of people's psyches somehow, but we have to self-select such that we have our somewhat same nutritional aspirations.
I think the food is a really good place that people could bind about, because we're talking about a framework we're talking about small scale. So we're talking about a household level, not the whole community. You're not converting everyone in your street to being vegan, for example, but you might quite easily find a fresh vegan group of 5 who want to do their own thing, or from hospitality workers who want to continue down the French cuisine and explore that to its nth degree, and that would be maybe an amazing place if that's your interest.
If that's your thing.
Food is one of those core values that, done well, could be an enormously empowering ingredient.
And I think also I noticed, early on in the conversation we were having, initial stages, I remember, Alison lived with all people who were all vegans, or along that same path, so I wonder a bit like, the comment there about, I only, use local and fresh. I think there's something to that if there is an alignment there, so if other people in your household are on the same path, then at least you've got some similarities, that you've got some alignment there, so that's where, where, finding that, purpose or unifying component might be, certainly an important part. And I think we've got a question there for the end, which is probably going to throw us in a lot of trouble, I suggest.
Right on the bus.
Yeah, but I mean, we want to have these conversations because also it's about, hearing, everyone's thoughts in regards to it as well. So I'll read that comment out for comment at the end as well, to have a conversation. One area that I did want to touch on with the healthy housing is, from my own personal experience, I found quite interesting is, even this idea that we keep advancing our technologies and our ideas, and we do have this sort of a little bit of a thought that because it's new, it's got to be best sort of attitude. And lighting is one of those areas in modern housing that I think a lot of people don't really understand. And again, I think it comes back to what you said before, Christine, is that at our biological basal level, we do have this situation that we grew up primarily around knowing that when the sun went down, we went to sleep, right? So, but everyone's sleeping patterns now are all over the place, and obviously for the capital overlords, the way to keep us working more was to give us more light hours, so that either we could work longer, so then we could still have light and enjoy ourselves afterwards. But along that journey, we've started to mess with our biology and our way we work. And I was really interested in one of the stuff I read just recently, with this idea that all these artificial lights, both from incandescent through to fluorescent through to LED, they're all affecting our pineal gland in a way that really wrecks our circadian rhythm, which is the idea of us understanding the difference between night and day. And interestingly enough, the firelight does not have that impact on our pineal gland. So sometimes we get a little bit too smart for ourselves. And I think that goes back to a lot of the other stuff you talked about earlier. We really do have this situation where sometimes we just need to get the data, like you talked about, Christine, and pull back and then say, hang on, what the hell are we doing here? And maybe sometimes the old stuff is just as, or, there's a lot of stuff that we need to take from what we've already learned.
And speaking
so it's always a question of what you have to strip away and what you have to add in. And I think that, I'll say something a little bit controversial here because I don't want to be a fattest, ageist, sexist, totally judgmental human being. But I think that, that we just had a question and I've just realized those are comments that are in the, I hadn't realized that. I'm not very smart about technology, but I finally twigged what we're looking at. The question was about, but it was about obese children. Well, I don't feel like I really want to tell somebody else how to raise their child, but I think I would reject a morbidly obese person to be in my group who wasn't working on their health problem. So it's not that I'm fattest, or I'm certainly not ageist. I'm too old to be ageist, aren't I? But the fact is that there has to be an indication that you're looking to do the right thing for yourself, that you've already looked into, okay, what did Paleolithic people eat? Well, they ate in a way that every time they saw some fat, every time they saw some sugar, and every time they saw some salt, they gobbled it up because there just wasn't enough of it. So we sort of had this fantasy about people living as hunter-gatherers and they were eating animals, but what animals were they eating? They weren't eating a pig that had never moved a step in his life, that has so much fat on everything that it can't move. They were hunting down animals that had to be able to run quickly. So they were all lean as lean as lean. You buy kangaroo for your dog or for yourself, it's the leanest meat around. Horse meat, lean, unless you got fat horses. But we've developed cows and pigs to be really fat, and we have this sociobiological, anthropological need to fill ourselves full of fat, sugar, and salt because they're going to be rare. Well, they aren't anymore. So how do you balance out your urges that come from sometimes millions of years of development, not just hundreds of thousands, because they pre-existed even the human race, Homo sapiens. So how do we actually get our appetites in order? And that's our appetite for EMFs, our appetite for fat, salt, and sugar, our appetites for talking too much, our appetites for being bossy, our appetites for being in control. Because there has to be a certain amount of control, or you're just eating all the same shit everybody else eats and end up morbidly obese or whatever, or diabetic or with metabolic syndrome. And so how do you figure out that I have to control myself? I have to self-manage, but I don't have to control everything about myself, and I don't have to control anybody else. And yet I want to be with people who will support me in my interest in eating healthy, being healthy, living healthy. So I think there's an awful lot to balance out in what we're doing. And I don't want to be dogmatic about things, but I think there are a few things that the older I get and the sicker I get, the more I realize I have to be with people who are supportive of my health goals. And that means
I think
exercise right and doing the right thing by your autonomic nervous system and by everybody else's.
Yeah. And I think that even goes to answer a little bit of that question that, is what's your thoughts on morbidly obese children that are taken away from their parents and sent to get healthier? And I think one of the things that we have noticed, and so we've been doing a lot of research about, how do groups work? How do you have good forming humans? And we've also probably to some extent done some work in regards to the fact that we all have inherent traumas as children. Now, those are big, small, and different. We're not all having these horrible stories that you hear on the news, but there's no doubt that we all have a certain level of trauma. So for me, answering that question, this is just a personal opinion, that I think the idea of taking children away from their parents is probably not solving the problem, because it might actually create a larger issue just from the separation side of things. But I do think that there's no use that child returning to an environment where, as you said, everyone has the desire to continue to shovel stuff into their mouth. Now, you're 100% right. I think the problem we have in our society today is that we've got so much food that we just don't know what to do with it. And it is a biological imperative. We have been bred with this to consume as much as we can. So I think being aware and learning and educating the parents to help the children, to me, would be a better response, because we're all on this journey of trying to be aware of ourselves as humans. And we talked about this idea of not just self-improvement, but self-awareness and self-unfolding, to the point we go, hang on, why am I having this drink now? Am I just trying to, numb something that was a bad event today? Or am I shoving this cake in my face because I've had a shitty day and I just don't want to do that anymore? So there's some more underlying components, which means just removing the food, I don't think, is the answer. There needs to be people work in the background to ensure that not only do you learn better habits and awareness of those habits, but as you said, you return to an environment which is going to be consistent with you continuing on. And I think that's even, you hear that with Alcoholics Anonymous. You don't want to go to a pub and try and get away from being an alcoholic. So there's this idea that your environment needs to support your goals. So, I personally think you probably need to work on the education piece before moving on to the separation piece. So don't know what your thoughts were about that question, Rowan.
I think in the history of intervening and separating kids from families has not worked spectacularly well. So it would seem to be a last resort.
Yes.
But how do we get people to take on learning and evolve themselves? Do we have a right to be a very limited version of ourselves, despite what good advice or people around us would say to the contrary? So
yes,
it's certainly a difficult question with no easy answer.
Yeah,
I think what I'd like to add about that is that was a great question. But in fact, we're not sociologists.
No.
We're trying to solve a housing problem. So we don't feel like we're sort of experts in every aspect of human life. Yeah. And those aren't questions. Yeah, you are.
I think we can have opinion by qualifying that opinion of we're not experts. Exactly. We're not shooting from high ground.
No, and I think that where we really want to be is focusing on how do we bring people together, not how do we take the because one reason we have government is to try to look after programs that help people learn and do things. That's not our job. Our job is to find people who've already done the work on themselves. And I think that's why I said, I don't want to be a fattest person, or a body shamer, but in fact,
good point.
I don't want to be hanging around with people who are eating lamingtons from morning to night, because I want to be with people who care what they put in their bodies, care how they feel, care how we treat the planet. And I think, the occasional splurge is great, but I don't want to be hanging around with alcoholics, criminals. I don't want to be hanging around with people who haven't taken their own need for their own health into their own interior, such that they're working on those things. And I feel terrible about the young man that was mentioned, but I can't solve that problem. And I have such a struggle even thinking about being a better person and finding steps to being a better person. I don't want to tell anybody else how to do that.
Yeah, good point.
Christine, I think I would be the same, that if there were people around me who have had good evidence and don't want to change a bad behaviour, and I've got a list of bad habits and bad behaviours that is terrible. So I'm not shooting from high ground.
Yes.
But, I don't know, Ron. I think you're a lot more praiseworthy than that myself. But the point is that you're working on yourself. And and Tender Teddies, thank you. Off to bed. Glad to meet you, and can't wait to see you back again with your great questions. But we're about to head off ourselves. It's time to wrap this up. And I do think that a lot of responsibility for myself and responsibility for the people that I have committed to hanging out with and being close to is something that I really feel is terribly important. And that goes across a whole gamut of perspectives and behaviors. And Rowan, I think you do a great job of looking after everybody else and maybe not looking after yourself well enough.
You've now been told, Rowan.
Oh, go and sort myself out. As a really brief anecdote, I wrote a note about this, which is relevant for health, and I'll be as brief and concise as I can. When we put our mind to healthy outcomes, it is actually quite amazing what we can achieve. By way of an example, there's a school in Brisbane that had a very proactive PNC, Parents and Friends Committee, who said at the start of COVID, what's the science behind this? Let's test, get the data, and then let's prevent COVID transmission in our school, and they have.
Great.
So they are one school that absolutely has had no student-to-student or teacher-student, anyone within the school transmit to another person, and that can apparently be readily found out.
That's amazing.
So they've had people sick and they've had people go home sick, but they've never had anyone in that school transmit within the school community, which I think is to be applauded. So
that's a big deal.
We can do good health outcomes.
Big deal.
And it's a good group outcome too. So that goes to show when people are united in a response, what we can achieve. Yep. So I think that's a very good point, even just as a correlation to what we're attempting to achieve.
And it's inspirational. It's inspirational because life is so complex now. I don't know how, I don't know how two working parents with a couple of kids who don't have a manager of their whole lives, because they've got two different businesses, perhaps, but your life has become so complex that your life is a business now. And if we don't all have a business manager, how do we have the time? Well, I think that's where we need a supportive group that can help us all work towards healthier minds, healthier bodies.
Yep, absolutely.
A great way to, wrap up the whole conversation. I think that fits, a great segue.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Darren.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Had a great conversation.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you very much. We'll look forward to getting in next Monday. We're talking about getting some guests in. So it'd be lovely to have a guest participation If we can't, if the stars and planets aren't aligning for that, I
really wanted to have a chat about, I know this is probably short notice, but we've been dancing around this integral housing conversation, and I'd really like to dive into it a bit. It could get a bit deep and philosophical, but I think it fits in with our philosophy of what we're trying to add with housing. So if we can't find someone else to join in with our, what do humans want from their housing conversation, which I think is really valid as well, but I'd really love to dive into that if we got the time.
Sounds
all right.
good.
Well, let's make a call, toss a coin, whatever. Who's kicking with the breeze, and we'll do integral housing.
Awesome.
You happy with that, Christine?
I'm all in. I'm all in.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you very much.
Good
See
night.
you Monday, 6:30 next week.
Thanks,
Good night.